Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Nguisse Nare natural processed Ethiopia from Moonwake Coffee Roasters. And there's the box right there. And Moonwake, based out of San Jose, California. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on several occasions, including a recent review of one of Pepe Ihon's Sidra coffees. And in that review, I made reference to a coffee that Moonwake reached out to us about, and that is this coffee right here, as it is one of the most discussed coffees over the course of this year, with a number of other notable roasters also offering their own Nguisse Nare. But this coffee did catch my interest for a couple of reasons, which we'll go over throughout this review. But for now, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. This right here is day 57. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe in a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. So that is one of the first things that did catch my interest about this coffee, as this one is listed as one of their ultra light offerings. And from the photo that we include at the start of each of our videos, you can tell that the coloring on this one is extremely light, especially relative to what you had experienced from a standard natural processed coffee. So I can definitely say that this is on the extremely light side of the spectrum, as it's one of the lightest roasted coffees we've had from any American coffee roaster this year, even on par with some of the ultra light coffees that we'd had from H&S as well. All of this to say, this is an extremely light coffee by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 30, first impression, and with their Nova series, they do request that you wait the minimum of 4 weeks before starting their coffee. So we waited that minimum 4 weeks and a couple days as well, with a day 30 start time, opting for the V60. And the first thing that was noticed was an above average level of clarity for a natural processed Ethiopian coffee, followed up by an intensity in line with the listed grape aspect. That's a fair bit reminiscent of the berry-like characteristic that you typically experience from natural processed Ethiopian coffees. In addition to that, there's a notable bit of yellow fruits lending itself towards a pretty decent start. We move on to day 33 as we opted for the Chemex, and there was a pretty similar sentiment this time around, as the cup is continuing to offer an above average level of clarity for a natural processed coffee, with plenty of the yellow fruits present yet again, and a grape aspect coming through a bit more as a secondary characteristic this time around. So once again, another nice day of this coffee. We move on to day 36 as we opted for the April brewer, and this is the first time that we'd experienced some mixed results, as the balance of the coffee is a little bit better with some of the heavier aspects toned down and a bit more defined of a yellow fruit aspect. So listed mango felt pretty apt, but the cup does continue to offer a slight bit more tame of an overall experience, trending in a much more positive direction nonetheless, as I felt like this coffee is just improving with some time. So we move on to day 39 as we opted for the V60 with Moonwake's recipe. And I've referenced before that Moonwake's recipe is very similar to our own. It's just a little bit of a lowering of the temperatures themselves at 94 degrees Celsius. And there was a slight bit less clarity and even a bit of a grainy quality that was hindering the overall cleanliness to the cup. And oftentimes I can experience a grainy quality with, I would say, lighter profiled and slightly more processed coffees. And I think that's the case with this one right here, as the listed grape continued to feel apt, with the berry tones also pretty intense and prominent through it. So I could say that a little bit less clarity through this day. We move on to day 42 through the Chemex with Moonwake's recipe, and similar issues to the previous day, as it's hindered ever so slightly by a grainy quality. Grape continues to feel much more apt, as there is a slight heaviness to it, so those adjustments didn't necessarily seem to help. And truth be told, I felt maybe a lowering of the temperature might lower some of those heavier qualities, and in place of it, maybe tone down some of the intensity of the coffee. But that's not necessarily what happens, as sometimes that seems to happen when I do make those adjustments with slightly more processed coffees. So on day 45, we went back to the V60 with our standard recipe, and it's improved a lot from some of the previous days, as it's offering a slight bit more of the sweetness, with the yellow fruits having a much more desserty feel to them, being a little bit more reminiscent of what I describe as a yellow ice cream, yellow popsicle sort of component to it. Slight tropicality as well, with the coffee seeing incremental improvement with time. Day 48 through the Chemex, and this was perhaps the best day of the coffee to this point because the clarity did seem to increase slightly, and I'm going to discuss that a little bit more in the tasting wheel, but that's a really big and important thing that happened within this coffee because a slightly more clean profile did seem to just move it in the right direction enough to a point where I would say that it was improved enough to make it a much more enjoyable natural processed coffee for me. Improves as the cup does cool down with an abundance of the sweetness and tropical yellow fruits present. Yet again, plenty of the profile is sweet and intense throughout, though this time it's coming out a little bit more in a cleaner sense. Day 51 through the Chemex and is once again having a very similar result, as I feel like if you kind of look at this in terms of a chart, it seems to have just skyrocketed in terms of the overall intensity, but it seems to have kind of reached that point where it's sloping, it's peaking. It hasn't necessarily reached the point where it's going to stop with the overall intensity, but it is plateauing for the most part. So I think that we're really close to reaching that on this day. Higher than average level of clarity, with it still being the most defining factor of this coffee. And I do have to say that for any natural processed coffee, when you're experiencing a much more clean and defined profile, that's going to immediately insinuate it as one of the most important profiles of this coffee. Grape aspect continues to be the most prominent. Yellow fruits now, once again, a secondary quality, though still abundant with an ever so slight fermentiness to it. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a lot of level 4s, but we're going to start with the finish, level 4. So as I mentioned in the Pepe Sidra review, I am always looking for these more processed coffees to maybe hold true and be a little bit more stable without being too intense and offering too much of a lingering finish to them. And that's the case with this one right here, as while it is a little bit more intense, I do have to say that the finish is very even, and that's a very nice selling point for me to start with this one as the second part that comes with it. The sweetness is very high there at that level 4, and once again, we're offering it in a very fruit-forward sweet profile to it. So those two things being a much more even and kind of balanced finish does really seem to help the overall experience of this coffee, and it's something that's going to play a big role in one of the other things we're discussing on this tasting wheel. Acidity level 4. That being said, the profile of this one's very light, and I guess I should say, not really surprised how much brightness there was within this coffee, especially given that it did offer plenty of citric qualities throughout the entirety of it. So brightness scoring there at that level 4, definitely not surprised in that regard. Berry fruit, level 4. And I can say that this does have a little bit of that more modern, natural Ethiopian feel in terms of that ever so slightly heavier berry quality to it, though it's not to the extent where it is overbearing. But I do have to say that the listed sparkling grape makes a lot of sense. It's reminiscent of that, and given that it does come out ever so slightly more even than the average natural processed Ethiopian coffee, then I'm okay with that differentiating quality to it, and it's scoring there at that level 4 as opposed to anything above that. Citrus fruit, level 4. As I'm kind of thinking back on this one, I can't quite recall if they had any sort of yellow note listed on here, any sort of citric note listed on here. If I recall correctly, I think that there is something along the lines of a mango that's listed on here, which makes a lot of sense for the stone fruit quality, which does come out a little bit more in a fermenty sense. But that being said, the citric quality is in equal abundance to the rest of the qualities within this one. So having that score there at that level 4 is not really surprising, as we're reaching pretty good balance, I would say, for the fruit qualities, especially given that none of them are too overbearing within this coffee. Handful of level 3s. We will start with the florality level 3. And for me, I don't think it's one of the notes that they had listed on here, but it reminds me a lot more of those slightly darker floral aspects to it. So a little bit of that jasmine-like, a little bit of that heavier jasmine-like sense to it, a little bit of that lavender-like sense to it, which I don't think is something that was maybe discussed too much within this coffee, but it was present enough to warrant a level 3 within this tasting wheel. Caramel level 3. There is a slight bit of a, I would say, sugary enough sense that kind of justified pushing that mark above it. I don't know for sure. I'm pretty sure though Moonwake also roasts with a probat, which would make a little bit of sense why it scored as high as it did on that specific quality. And then one other thing worth discussing before we discuss the big thing, we'll discuss the body at a level 2. So this one right here did have a lighter body to it, and I feel like that might have been at play for a number of reasons, first of which being that we are working with an Ethiopian coffee, which does tend to offer a lighter body, and in addition to that, this is brewed with a Chemex, which I think is going to be the secondary reason why it did score in that specific category. And then the final and most important thing worth discussing that we waited until the very end, the cleanliness, level 4. Okay, I'll be honest, it's a little generous to score it there at that level 4 mark, but the more and more I continued to think about it, I said, okay, the actual cleanliness of this coffee is probably somewhere closer to the higher side of level 3, mostly because it is offering a very slight grain quality, though with the adjustments, not as much. It is offering a very slight fermentiness within the berry quality, though not to the same extent as your average natural processed coffee. It is offering a slight fermentiness to the stone fruit-like sense, but once again, not to the average extent of a natural processed coffee. And then as I'm kind of thinking about it, I said the definition of a lot of the aspects within this coffee are pronounced and defined enough to the point where that part reaches the level 4. So it's on the higher side of level 3.5 for me. And I said, I'm going to be very generous and I'm going to bump it up to level 4. And I think a lot of people did experience a more clean version of this coffee than I did. But even then, I have to say that with a little bit more time, it's also increasing in the overall cleanliness. So I think based off the way the coffee is trending, that's the other reason I was able to and justify bumping it up to the level 4 mark. But outside of that, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my raw thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I did like it, and I feel like going into it, there was a very high bar that was set for this coffee, mostly because of how many positive things I had heard about it. And I definitely did experience a lot of some really positive traits, because there are certain, and I have to say, slightly fleeting moments where this coffee is just very clean, enough to the point where you do forget for a split second that it is a natural processed coffee. But as mentioned, it's fleeting because you do experience enough of the qualities to kind of contrast that to the point where it's not necessarily the most clean coffee out there. But at the same time, it's still offering sweetness in terms of such a different and wide range of fruit profiles to it. All three of the fruit profiles scored at that level 4 mark, which does go to demonstrate just how much depth there is in the fruit qualities of it. And in addition to that, there is still plenty of brightness as well. So there's a lot to really like about this coffee. And I think for me, it's definitely going to finish on the more enjoyable end of natural processed coffees that I've had this year. Though that being said, I think natural processed coffees are still having a little bit of a down year, as I don't have anything that's been necessarily a true standout. And so for that reason, I can definitely say that this is one of the more enjoyable naturals that I've had. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, I feel like the first place I should start is the very interesting profile of this one, given that it is extremely light, because I think that translated most specifically to the brightness and a slight bit of an overall result in terms of the cleanliness. So keep that in mind, because I think that might be either a very interesting quality to some people, or it might be an off-putting quality to some people, because I know some people find these overly light coffees to not necessarily be in line with their own preferences. But this one right here, I think it did a very nice job of giving this coffee a little bit more of a unique feel to it relative to the average natural processed coffee that you have this year. That being said, it's still offering a nice bit of the qualities that you do want from a natural processed coffee. Great intensity, plenty of fruit characteristics to it as well, and great sweetness as well, while still offering a very interesting, brighter aspect to it. I think that's the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Nguisse Nare, natural processed Ethiopia from Moonwake Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.